The second Russia-Africa summit is expected to get underway today. Several heads of African states are expected to attend this two-day summit in St. Petersburg, with food security being a priority on the agenda. Just last week, Russia withdrew from the Black Sea grain deal, which ensures the safe export of Ukraine's grain. The summit has also received global attention due to Africa's stance on the war in Ukraine. So, what are the ideal outcomes, if you like, of this gathering? Let's get you some analysis with Senior Lecturer in Politics and International Relations at Leeds University. That's Dr. Olayinka Ajala, who joins us now via our video link. Doc, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks, as always, for making time. You know, part of what you argue in a recently published piece that you've written is that Russia is in somewhat of a weaker global position than it was perhaps this time last year. I wondered how leaders who are attending the summit from the continent ought to make the most of that, lest it's seen as some kind of lost opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I think the first thing the leaders have to do at the moment, as I wrote in that piece you mentioned, is for them to speak with one voice. So they need to have a very clear agenda of what they want to achieve collectively. Because what we've seen before in previous negotiations between African countries and their partners around the world is that a lot of times individual interests sometimes overshadow the collective interest. So the first thing they need to achieve is to make sure they speak with one voice and be very clear about what they want to achieve.
Yeah. How likely is that, though, because of what you've just mentioned, the fact that in many instances we see national interests being in conflict with the collective?
Well, at the moment now, there are serious collective issues facing African countries, and the chief of that is the issue with food insecurity, which you mentioned, related to the deal which Russia pulled out of last week. So there are certain issues at the moment that are of great importance. You just also mentioned the issue with Niger this morning, which is also a very sad situation. So I think the issue of food security, defining and deciding the different security arrangements with Russia, these are the things that the African leaders can actually achieve. We all know that they are. At the moment, Russia doesn't have a lot to offer. And this is one of the reasons why I think this morning it's been reported that just about 17 leaders will be attending this summit. So while there are national differences and some issues that would be on the table, there are also some specific collective issues like food security, security more broadly that can be achieved within and during this summit.
Yeah. I wonder what you make of the dynamics, Doc, among the African leaders that are there themselves. You know, traditionally, maybe even in literature, South Africa is kind of seen as the de facto class captain, if you like, of African leaders. I don't know how true that is, so maybe you'll set me straight on that. But the same country has also had an interesting relationship with Russia this month alone. You know, this is, I think, President Cyril Ramaphosa's second visit to Russia. And again, there are expectations that he'll be quite forthright around how specifically the war, as an example, is affecting countries on the continent. Do you think South Africa still holds that position among the delegates that are there from the continent?
Yeah, they still do. South Africa still does hold that position to a very large extent. Currently, South Africa is still the second largest economy in Africa. The SADC is still a very strong bloc, and they are very vocal, especially when it comes to issues of regional and continental interest. So while countries like Nigeria might not fully decide what they want to do, South Africa has been very clear right from the beginning. So despite the fact that there are differences here and there, I think South Africa still holds a very strong and important position in leading this conversation, especially because the president will be attending this summit.
Yeah. And, you know, when it comes to, I suppose, look, if we're going to try and gauge what can possibly come out of the summit in terms of tangibles, we can kind of gauge of how things took place in 2019, I think it was, when the first summit was held. Was there anything to write home about that?
Sorry, I didn't get that question.
Essentially, I'm trying to gauge whether there's anything to clutch on, given how the first summit actually went. You know, do we find that this kind of gathering typically leads to easy wins, tangibles that actually change the material conditions of the countries where these presidents are from?
And that's the problem, and that's what I mentioned earlier. There are some gains, but not broad issues, so to say. And that is why many countries try to push their national interest, because they understand that these things are easier to achieve than collective agenda, or big issues discussed during this conference. So we've seen an increase since 2019. We've seen an increase, for instance, in a number of African students studying in Russia, especially in the fields of engineering. One key thing that I've seen flying around from the agenda is that Russia wants to increase its relationship, especially in relations to things like engineering and technology. These sanctions would be a big problem for Russia in terms of achieving this. But they can go around that by, instead of giving technological support in terms of hardware, they can give human resources. So they can say, well, we might not be able to give you the physical hardware or infrastructure now, but we can send engineers. We still have engineers. We have technocrats that we can actually send to your country to train you and to help you. And that way you will still have a form of, it can still be painted as achieving something in form of engineering and technological innovations and advancements. But at the moment, even in 2019, some of the things that, it's significant to understand that some of these things were achieved, to be fair, in terms of it's slightly significant increase in trade between African countries and Russia, not at the scale that was envisaged in 2019, but there has been an increase. But I'm sure what Russia will be trying to do now is to look at ways and how they can frame this as a success, even if big and tangible things were not achieved.
Yeah. You mentioned food insecurity should be one thing that these leaders focus on, and security. Let's talk about the latter. Currently the dynamic is that many countries on the continent rely on Russia to provide them with weapons to fight insurgencies. Should we be happy about the arrangement of that agreement, or do you reckon there's ways through which it could also help Africans more than it currently does?
Yeah, I actually think it's time for African countries to be more assertive in terms of the kind of security architecture that they want. We've seen that proxy security through PMCs and private military companies is not working. Lots of human rights abuses. Ghana has been very vocal. Some other African countries have been very vocal when it relates to the security architecture. So I think in terms of because we know there's going to be reduced numbers of attendance in terms of from African leaders, the issue of this is the time for African leaders to be very clear about the kind of security arrangement and how they want this to be. They need to take agency when it comes to this issue of security, because Russia would definitely not want to lose the remaining allies, especially those who are attending. So Russia would be in a situation where they want to offer something tangible, and that is where African countries need to then unite and decide on what they want, and they need to be very clear that they want direct support from Russia, and they want it without private military companies, which clearly is not working in Africa.
Absolutely. Plenty to think about in the lead-up to the summit. Dr. Olayinka Ajala, thanks very much indeed for helping us think through some of those complexities. Dr. Ajala is with the Leeds Beckett University in the UK. Thanks once again, Doc.